Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I think we can hop right in. I'll just introduce Naima and OVAC a little bit and we can get started. But if you haven't met me before, my name is Ariana. I work at OVAC, and we're organizing this workshop with Naima today. We're really happy to have her here to talk about navigating artist funding. And our mission here at OVAC is to grow and develop Oklahoma's visual arts community through education, promotion, connection, and funding. And we have all different kinds of programs we offer throughout the year. We offer like workshops and talks like this for professional development for artists. We offer exhibitions, and we also offer grants. Our applications are open right now for our Thrive grants, which is one of our major funding opportunities that we do annually. So I thought it would be a good time to have a conversation about the practice of applying to grants and funding for artists. Um, and yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce Naima before we get started. Naima makes performances, texts, drawings, installations, and videos using transgressive and radical traditions of Black utterance. She rigorously cultivates and protects her intuitive sensibilities, fed by a deep intellectual and familial allegiance to the libertary ethos of improvisation. She uses the specificity of her personal and family history to create works about desire and longing, amplifying and abstracting emotional states to unsettle the perceived boundary between mind, body, spirit, and one another. And she has a BA from Brown University, an MFA from Temple University. She's shown her work at Ann Arbor Film Festival, Wing Luke Museum, Mixed Experimental Film Festival, and she has done countless residencies at the Bemis Center, the Vermont Studio Center, the Lighthouse Center Works, and been an artist fellow at different organizations such as the Mid-America Arts Alliance, and she was also a recipient in 2022 of the Jazz Road Creative Residency. So we're really lucky to have her here today. As you can see, she has a lot of experience with like national, regional, and local funding programs. So she's going to talk today about her experience with participating in funding programs and applying to them, and giving some tips and advice for the application process, and just maintaining a positive mindset when applying to these types of opportunities, because for most artists, it's a career-long practice, that just like your artwork, it takes practice and time. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and I'll pass it over to Naima and we'll get started.
Hi, folks. Good to be spending a little time with you. I am um, excited to do this presentation in this setting and share some of what I know. The first thing that I'll just say as like sort of a general caveat around uh, really anything in terms of like navigating an artist's career. Sort of, professional development along, just like kind of our practices are completely unique to us. I'm going to speak to the ways that I've navigated these things up until now, and even that is in the process of changing because that's as you have probably learned and know, is that our lives, our practices, our approaches, our professional needs are always evolving alongside the sort of landscape. I'm not going to talk so much, although it's funny, I made this presentation before the recent sort of announcements about cuts to the NEA and NEH and just general kind of, I would just name it straight out like anti-expression kind of mandates from our sort of political class. But in some ways, I think the things that I'm saying overall will still sort of apply because I'm thinking about sort of an approach that's like long term. And the main thing I would just recommend in general is like excited to share this. It's going to be recorded, there'll be notes, etc. But I would just encourage you to take advantage of any opportunity like this to hear from somebody who has experience, in this terrain, to just hear some of their approaches. Each artist is going to do it differently. People from different regions, different mediums, different kinds of education, et cetera, are going to approach this differently. And you should always feel open and free, and empowered to sort of like collage together what makes sense for you. Um, and what I'm going to be speaking to is a period of my work from like 2017 kind of to the present, where I was really trying to like deepen my practice. I've been teaching for a while in kind of a small city, and I was feeling kind of stuck in terms of my work being seen in a broader audience, and wanted to just sort of like up the ante. And so that was specifically what I was doing. I wanted to travel. I wanted to meet artists in other places. I wanted to sort of have, sort of develop my ideas for other audiences. And so I created this approach, which I will call colloquially, how to apply to every friggin' thing. So that is what I did for a while, or at least that's how it felt. So I'm going to start my presentation. Folks should feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go, and we'll also have like Q&A at the end. And yeah, so get this going. Okay, so how to apply to every friggin' thing. So since 2017, as I said, I was applying to, short and long-term residencies, grants of various sizes, sort of fellowships that, would have me working where I was or moving to another area. Um, and that was like, not the only aspect of my sort of professional life, but a significant part of it was sort of using those opportunities to kind of like develop my profile, develop my projects, fund my projects, and just kind of practice being in the mix in those ways. So in that time frame, I probably applied to about 80 to 100 things, distinct things. And in terms of actual applications, it was probably more than that, because there's some of them that I would apply to more than once. And in fact, it is very common, especially with things that are like a bigger profile, that you apply to things more than once. That is very common. Um, and of that, I received maybe 12 to 15, which is frankly a pretty good record as I think about it, because in my mind, it was less. Given the amount of time that I was, in terms of percentages. Okay. So just, and again, that's me ask around. Um, I, I, I learned and have been like learning about similar parallel processes for friends who are writers and working in publishing. And they've talked about how one of the tactics that people will take on if they're trying to get a book published or something published is that they, set up a set of goals around having a goal of getting 100 rejections, right? Because that is part of what is moving you towards getting the acceptance, right? And whether it's for them, it's a different process, it's a different, sort of institutional reality, but it's the same idea, which is that you're thinking about this whole terrain, not in terms of like, I got to get this one thing, but so much as like, in this profession of taking my work, which is my unique thing born of my creativity and mind and spirit, being translated into something that has a place within these like broader markets of all kinds, I gotta get it out there. And so you make a goal of 100 rejections. And so it's not even like you get the one thing and then you stop trying. It's like you keep trying to get rejected because that's part of getting your work out there. So and I guess that's part of what I've been doing for the last set 5, 7 years. Um, okay. So the places where I think, had kind of my um, done well, I guess, is in residencies and grants that have a sort of national and regional sort of regranting. And by regional regranting, I mean sort of big organizations like the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, et cetera, that redistribute, and the NEA, frankly, although we'll see how that goes, that grant smaller organizations that work regionally, right? And locally. So that's like what OVAC is. OVAC, you know, has fundraising capacities that are sort of local, but a lot of their grants, including the one that I've gotten from them, which is a Thrive grant, is a regional regranting from the Andy Warhol Foundation, which is like a big national, right? So that's where I sort of did pretty well, right? So the Bemis Center, the Malay, those are, in sort of small communities, but have kind of a national reputation. Tulsa Artist Fellowship here in Oklahoma. That's how I came to Oklahoma in the first place. I only stayed in that for a little while, but I decided to stay in Tulsa anyway, et cetera. And then also some various grants that didn't require that I go anywhere, but that allowed me to kind of develop projects. Okay, so um, there's a certain set of things that have a really, at least in my field, have like big big reputations that are hard to get, that people apply to over and over in their lifetime. It is very rare that people who apply for some of these get it the first time, right? And and so I say I'll apply to every year till I get it or die. Or in my case, I'm starting graduate school, and so some of them you're not eligible, so I'll stop for a while, and then maybe I'll start again. And and it can be hard, and these ones tend to have big application processes. And so I don't necessarily do them every year just for the sake of my own like energy. But I see them as, again, it's just part of what you do, is that you, at a certain point, you say, okay, do I meet the eligibility requirements, the baseline for these? Do I see people who are my peers kind of reaching at that terrain? I say yes. What do I feel like I need to do to start to try to get there? And so I start applying to these ones, right? Um, there's also a set of things that I won't apply to anymore, right? Because, the whole process, in its best, it is like I say, it's like, these organizations who have a vested interest in supporting artists nationally, and regionally and locally, who just want to redistribute the resources and make things happen, right? And that's great. And it's also an industry. It's also has bureaucracies. It also can be kind of a pain in the butt to do. And so there's certain things that, it's not worth it to me, right? Like, so I don't apply to certain things below a certain amount of money, especially if it's like, well, we are going to make you get three. I mean, honestly, almost anything that has a letter of recommendation, unless it's going to like change your whole life at this stage in the game, makes me bananas, and I think should be like outlawed because it is such a sort of like onerous additional piece of labor to give to both you and to the people writing. Like, I was a college professor. I was writing these dang letters all the time, and and having to have these like disappointing conversations with students who suddenly realized they needed one and didn't understand it, and then they had to ask me. I mean, it's just, like I said, unless it's like a very prestigious thing, I don't bother because it's just like not worth the energy. Um, and onerous, complicated application materials, et cetera, for a small amount. It's like, what could I do in my life to sort of gather up a grand as opposed to applying for a grant? Right? Like, those are, I'm not saying $1,000 isn't a lot of money, but like, what would be easier and more reasonable for my life, right? So And then there's a set of things that I'm like, probably at a certain stage, I would want to start applying to more. Again, I made this before was going to school, but things that I'm going to kind of look ahead to, right? And so I kind of stopped with Guggenheim because I was struggling with it. And maybe once I finish my PhD, I'll come back to it and kind of think about it again. Um, I think group shows are something that I'd probably benefit from doing more of. I've done them in video, but not in some of my newer work. And so maybe I need to start doing that. Um, because I'm writing more, so these are things that are specific to your field. So it would be useful to maybe think about those. And these are things that don't necessarily, group shows, journals, those kind of things, you're not making money, but you're getting your work out there and being in conversation with curators and things like that. And so it'd probably be useful, especially while I'm in school, where um, you are often not allowed to apply for things that maybe have those like big chunks of money attached to them, but you can just have your work in circulation, right? And so keeping my materials ready to be able to do that so that while I'm sort of on lockdown in, my dissertation or whatever, I'm still kind of like keeping my work in circulation. Um, Fulbright, that's a travel grant that's like sort of scholar specific, although there is an arts component of it. I think it still exists, US government. We'll see. I mean, it's international, but who knows? Um, again, my work is sort of open. I'm pretty cross-disciplinary, which can be hard in some ways, but also can have advantages because you can put your work into different places. And so these are just me thinking through like what would help me kind of be expansive in getting my work out there. Um, So this next section is just sort of like, yeah, this approach to just keeping it up. And like I said, I was keeping it up for like a while. And not that I'm not going to stop actually while I'm in school. It's just going to look different. Because there's like different expectations while you're doing like a PhD kind of program. But I just really think it is a kind of like, just like with our art, it's like there's a certain amount of kind of keeping the faith that you're doing, right? That we don't live in a culture that fundamentally values the arts. And so there is a certain amount of like personal and communal faith that we have to kind of put to the process in terms of making ourselves feel like the energy that we're expending towards these is like worth it, right? And I think that's how I've had to sort of like keep this, is really find a way or find a tactic that helps me to really feel like this is like worth the energy. So as far as keeping up is concerned, keeping your materials fresh. So keeping your CV or artist statements up to date. If there are places where there's opportunities for feedback, take them always. And always when you're sending out work samples of any kind, et cetera, always just give what is your best, whatever that is. Even if it's not the thing that for you feels the like newest and freshest, your goal for these is to put your best self in front of these other people, and having your materials sort of ready to share that are like, the freshest version of these things keeps it easier, and it's a good habit to keep up. Stay in touch with people, right? So I'm bad about this, having a newsletter or, emails, social media, those kind of things. So people have a sense of like what you're up to in your practice. This can be for that reference gathering kind of thing, but also because the way that these programs application processes work is because we, as in your community, as in other artists, and curators and people in your communities, are who are on those selection committees, right? I mean, every organization works different, but most organizations that have open calls, right? There's plenty of things where there's grants and curatorial processes and stuff that aren't working on an open call basis. People are making the selections through networking. So again, you need to have people know what you're up to so that um, they can know and want to sort of engage with you. But when there are open calls, it's pretty standard, right? So if any of what of you have seen the calls with OVAC for, be part of a grant committee, that is very common to these, especially like regional regranting processes, that there are people who are other artists within the community, particularly other people who have gotten the grant or who work within that field, um, who are on those committees. So they're us, right? It's your peers. Um, and so people kind of having a sense of what you're up to and that you're sort of in the mix is to your advantage. And like I said, to really just think about this as part of your practice. Whatever time that you spend, I don't want to say this is the only thing that you should have in your practice. And I think it is super valid to take breaks from this, to be strategic with your time and energy, et cetera. But it is a chunk of it. You can think about it similarly to, marketing, communications, strategizing, however you want to kind of budget for like time and energy and resources is it's a part of the professional aspect of your practice. Um, you can also follow various sort of newsletters and lists to find out what's around. So OVAC sends out periodically lists of, regional opportunities that people can apply to. Many, many other organizations do the same on the, local, regional, and national level. And I highly recommend getting onto those mailing lists. So Mid-America Arts Alliance has one, Creative Capital has one. For residencies, there are like organizations that are sort of like kind of advocacy or organizations for residencies like the Alliance for Artist Communities, things like that, that have lists that go out. Hyperallergic and other arts publications, ArtNet, they all have these sort of listing roundups of different kind of opportunities that will be a mix of, genre specific, region specific, type specific, and just getting on them will just help you get a sense of what's out there. And then also look at the resumes and CVs and bios of artists that you respect and artists who you see yourself in sort of like parallel with. And look, be like, huh, that person did these three things. Maybe I should try doing these three things, right? Like when I first started the journey around residencies, I was like, that's what I want. I want to start going to residencies and meeting artists from other parts of the country. That's part of what can be really great about it. It was a couple of friends of mine who were like, well, I went to this one and it really was meaningful. And then I went to this one and it was meaningful. And so I looked at those and started applying, right? Like it was no more, complex than that. It was just people who had more experience than me, making suggestions. Keeping track. Now, my method of keeping track is really kind of chaotic. It's just like this Google Doc. I mean, this is the 2002 cycle. I keep it up. It's just like a running list. Google Doc. It's probably like, I don't know, 10 pages by now of just year by year links, deadlines, whether I finished it, whether I got it. And then I just update it every year. People do it in more organized ways. People have databases. I think there are some apps and stuff that can help you track it. This is just what I've done. And at this point, it feels more tedious to me to change it to something else, partly because the visual of a kind of running list works. But, it's um, the idea is the same, right? Of just sort of like having a sense of the volume of it and what's kind of coming. And so, yeah, keeping up with those is a useful thing to do. It also helps you, it can be a way to track your 100 rejections, right? Is to sort of see it in front of you. Okay. So then there's the last part, keeping the faith. Because, you know, especially in a moment like this, right? Where there's this sort of national, international erosion of free speech, of expression, of the kind of speech that is particular to artists, speaking truth to power, speaking about injustice, speaking on behalf of or from the experience of marginalization, being criminalized, et cetera. It's like it can feel really difficult to say, like, yeah, I'm just going to keep on trying to put myself out here in this moment, can be really disheartening. And even not in a moment like this, it can be disheartening because, as I said, these systems can feel rigged. It can feel like it's all a game instead of anything like a meritocracy. It can be exhausting. Um, and I think those are all valid concerns, right? I'm the last person to try to convince you that those concerns aren't real. But I have, my approach to this has been thinking about the ways, that I can sort of put everything in perspective is that by definition, there's always going to be more good applications and slots available. That's just how it works, right? And so not working on not taking it personally, thinking about, just the reality of that process and just keeping at it. Serving on selection panels. When you see those calls to serve on selection panels, do it. Do it, do it, do it. It is so useful. Partly it's just, service to the field. You don't get paid well. It is not about that, right? It is a way to do something that can be kind of nice, which is that you're in the room with other artists, looking at the work of other artists, and at the end you get to give money to artists, right? Which can be really nice and make you feel a little bit less like doomsday about the whole thing. And you learn a lot. You see what it looks like from the other side of these processes, both and it doesn't just have to, I mean, often people on those panels are people who have gotten those grants, but it's not a given. And so you can be eligible to look at them for all kinds of grants. And you'll meet other artists, you'll get a sense of the process, you'll see I always learn so much about the thing that I struggle with around clarity about what I'm doing, the difference it makes to take those extra steps to get really clear about your intentions, to connect your work to broader conversations, historically, conceptually, et cetera, and to communicate it well, because, and you'll also see why certain little nitpicky things might exist. Like, yes, maybe there's some annoying things that are just like, we've just done it this way, so we don't change it, like asking for letters. But then there'll be other little things like why we insist on asking for a sort of conceptual statement for your work, right? Some of us are kind of like, well, can the work just speak for itself? Well, sometimes it can, depending on the context in which the work is being evaluated. But sometimes it is extraordinarily important and useful to know that that artist is thinking more broadly than just the inside of their own head, right? And so being able to see that from the other side and see how much the process is a human process, right? That like sometimes you get a no or give a no, not because you're like, I'm just gonna just say no because I feel like it, but because it is a volume issue and you don't have a lot of time to look at each one. And it is on this little screen where you're looking, you know what I mean? And so that your ability to communicate clearly and have those best samples and a strong artist statement is like you're helping another artist sitting on the other side of that screen get the point quickly and be able to do their little brief, very underpaid job. Okay. This is, and I reiterate this, the audience is you, us, other artists, because I think it can feel really disheartening when we only think about the other side of these selection processes as gatekeepers who don't care about us. And some aspects of this process is gatekeepers who don't care about us, right? And I'll get to that. But a lot of the people who are at this level, who are looking at your work, who are making these evaluations, who are having these conversations, are just versions of us, right? They're other artists doing these roles, being in admin positions, doing their part for the community, et cetera, who really want to get to that end point where they get to support another artist. And that has been a very empowering framework rather than just like, why do I have to do it? Because just, I feel bad about my, it's like, that doesn't get me anywhere. Um, Another thing is to try to make the process feel interesting and worthwhile to you regardless, right? Because of all the ways, things I've already said about the numbers game that this is, the what makes it worth it to me, and I've had this experience many times, especially recently, where I get to the end of the process and I think, I learned something about my own work. So that even if I don't get it, which is statistically going to be the case more often than not, I still feel as though I have gotten something out of the process. I have articulated myself more clearly. I have updated my materials well. I have learned something about, I had an application for something recently that asked for materials in a slightly different way. It said, yes, give us a CV, give us your artist statement, but it also said, give us 3 career highlights to help us kind of understand your work. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so and it was so helpful, right? I got to the end and I really saw these linkages between, so it wasn't just lists, oh, I did this, I did this, I did this. It was like, this moment really helped me understand this about my practice. And this one really helped me understand this about my background and my education. And, and so I came away with it with something that I get to keep regardless of whether or not the lottery hits and I get that thing, right? It's a huge part of keeping the faith for me. Um, you know, there's also ways that the it can you can think of it as a game and sort of have it feel fun, right? And feel like you're curious and interested about ways you can win it. As well as what I'm talking about as far as sort of clarifying yourself. The other thing to think about is we go back to this issue of the people on the other side is you, us, other artists, curators, etc. Is that this is you circulating your work among your peers and among other people for free. Well, for $25 in some cases, right? But like getting it out there. And I've seen that. There was a point, especially in the beginning of this for me, where I would sort of apply and sort of apply, and it felt like it was going into nowhere. And then things started to hit, and I started to realize like part of it was because I was getting better at it, but part of it was because, these sort of circulations of juries and etc. It's like some of the same people are in there and some of, and my work is sort of coming around and I heard and I've seen and I've talked to, and that's when it started to hit because as somebody who, again, at that time was when I started living in a small community that wasn't as connected as I wanted it to be, this was a way for me to do the networking that I didn't have access to because I didn't live in, New York or wherever, right? And even if I did, I'm kind of a homebody, right? So this was a way to help do that. Um, you know, handling disappointment is important, right? For me, it's always been like the big picture stuff. I'm kind of like, yeah, well, literal geniuses don't get the Guggenheim, the Creative Capital, Studio Museum residency ever once in their lives, right? I mean, it's disappointing, but okay. Wherein I find it harder with the like smaller, very unique things that feel like just right. And, that's real. And so it's worth kind of like giving yourself the space to like process that emotional reality. And ding, ding, ding. Right. It's not your fault. Right. So in both cases, both that big picture thing and that really highly unique thing, right? This isn't a you thing, this isn't a me thing, this isn't an Ariana thing, right? It's even an OVAC thing. This is capitalism. This is a system that has been built around scarcity and competition that undervalues and exploits and is extractive to everybody, all workers, and artists are included in that category. And I don't say this to therefore be like, screw it all. No, I say it as a way of gaining perspective about what's happening within that process and to give it to support or to sort of give agency or encourage agency around thinking about these other pieces around being in communication and community with others, understanding processes better, learning how to advocate in favor of other alternatives, right? And both within these systems and beyond them because those exist, right? There are alternative funding strategies. There are ways to make art that don't require tons of money. There are ways to change the ways that we live and exchange goods. You know what I mean? Like those are all, there are ways that we can, be in community with each other that don't necessarily rely on the, gatekeeping. And really specifically, what I'll say in terms of, grants and the big funds and things like that is like, when I say it's 100% capitalism fault, anyone who knows me, I'll say that about many things, all things. But in particular, when it comes to grant funding, right, these are extractive billionaires giving us our money back, right? And doing so by demanding that we compete for it. We wouldn't need foundations if those people hadn't stolen all of our money in the first place through extractive means. However, however, here's where we are. And within those systems, there are people like Ariana and like OVAC and like these other organizations trying to do their best to make what is possible within those systems as as available for redistribution as possible. So I see it as like a both and. We think about alternatives, we take breaks, we resist, we advocate various other ways to engage around value, et cetera. And we engage in as good faith as we can with the good actors within the bad system, right? And we decide to, opt out. If anyone ever wants to talk to me about I promised myself I wouldn't crap talk today about any foundations that I don't like, and I think are not operating in good faith. And I'm happy to do that if anyone wants to email me. But I actually think at this stage in my process, I'm trying to sort of like focus my attention on the ones who I think are operating in good faith. Because for me to do the things that I want to do as an artist in my capacity to get my work into a larger audience, that's what gets me there. Right. But also, as one of my mentors and good friends often will say to me when I'm like, is she says, you will get 0% of the things you don't ask for. So that's where am I? Okay, I didn't do too bad. So that's my sort of general spiel. I know I talked fast and a lot. I'm gonna stop the share. Um, and yeah, we're a small group, so I'll just open it to questions. Can pop off just hop right on, put it in the chat, call out, whatever is useful.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
Okay, awesome. First, that was a great presentation. Thank you. That
You're
was
welcome.
amazing. And I appreciate like your honesty and vulnerability and everything that you shared about that process with us. Um, I have a couple questions.
Yeah. I'm sorry,
My
what's your
first
name?
question is like applying to 80 to 100 applications in that time. Like me and Issa are applying to 3 this year, and
Mhm.
it's
Cool.
difficult to balance that with the other things that are going on in our lives. And I'm just wondering, like, how did you how did you do that? Like, did you get super burnt out, or did you have like strategies or ways of managing your time where that was kind of sustainable for you?
That's a great question. I'm sorry, what's your name?
My name is Dylan.
Dylan and Isa. Good to see you. Um, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the answer is like yes to all. I did burn out at various times. I did find it hard to balance sometimes, and I still do. Um, and I did also, it got easier over time because once you have done that initial kind of, once you've written the initial thing, it's not that you don't have to update it around each project, but you're not inventing it from whole cloth and each time. And the more you do it, just like any other practice, the easier it will become to kind of know how, right? And where to ask for advice, et cetera. So those first ones, the first thing for the first, even if the first is always the hardest, right? So it's like both the first time you do it, the first time you do it for a specific project, even. So it's like for me, I'm in a stage right now where it's a project that's coming and I'm like, oh God, now it's new and I gotta come up, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, I kind of don't even know what I'm talking about yet. And I gotta come up with what to talk about, versus something that I've like done and it's sort of like at the midpoint and I'm asking, you know what I mean? I'm like, got it. Here's 15 different versions of the statement, all the materials, da da da. Some strategies that I've kind of come up with to help with that problem is to do it a lot and maybe do it in sort of low stakes contexts if I can, so that I get practice that doesn't feel like it's overwhelming. So if there are little like, you know, not little, but like either smaller grants or ones with smaller amounts of expectations or feedback sessions with friends, like doing little round robins, practicing setting deadlines to share. My main gig right now is I work for this like artist run online organization called At Lewis Place, where it's about writers. It's about writing and it includes artists and writers of all kinds. And one of the things that we're consistently doing is setting up ways for people to get and give feedback on applications for things, right? So it's sort of like a soft deadline to sort of be like, okay, I gotta write this thing, you know what I mean? Or I gotta share with people and, do things like I gotta do that 50-word statement, right? Like pieces of it that are harder for you so that you just get practice doing it. So that's helpful. Um, I would say that that's also where being discerning is helpful. So when I talk about onerous processes, right, there are like 3 or 4 different primary platforms that most grant programs use. And I'm so grateful for those because then you know, samples are saved and you can see what you did before and you can kind of keep track of stuff you know, and that's incredibly helpful. It drives me bananas then to see an organization. I get it, these things cost money, it's, et cetera. But it's like, come on, guys, where they're like, well, what we would like you to do is come up with something that's completely unique, send it by passenger pigeon, pay us a fee, get 5 references, you know what I mean? And then you're like, so that's part of where that like, I'm not going to do it stuff comes from, because it's like, it's not worth it. Right. So the answer is yes to all of what you're saying, is that like I did burn out and I know I've heard people do different things where they'll like, for some of those big ones like Guggenheim, Creative Capital, where they'll just for the sake of their own internal sense of self do 1 year on, 1 year off instead of every year, just to kind of give themselves a break from the process. Um, I think finding camaraderie is huge. And so if there are application support sessions, of any kind, always do them. If your um, grant program offers it, do it, because that will be encouraging. That grant officer's job is to get the best possible grants in front of the committees. And so that's not, it's not cheating, it's not skipping the line, it's just helping you. And that can help, I think, with that sense of like, it's not gatekeepers, it's people vibe, which for me is a big part of the like not having it just kind of wear me down. Because if all I can see in front of me is this billionaire's name, as opposed to Ariana, right? Like it just feels different, right? In terms of just being in conversation and feeling like it's a worth my time, sort of spiritually, I guess. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of other things. I also will sometimes just for I have a friend that friend Stephanie who I was talking about who is very clever and good at doing this and has a also probably is both better at it than me and has probably even more of a kind of like frustration critique about it because she's done it so much, is that she sets timing on how much time she will spend on something just so it doesn't like, where she's like, it gets this amount of time. That's it. And part of that is that it pushes her to not overthink things and it helps take away that sense of like, oh, I've given everything. And so you can be choosy about where you like put your whole self in versus where you're like, this gets a day, this gets blank, da da da. Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of setting a time limit for applications.
Mm,
The other question that I had is a bit more specific, which is the conversation about work samples. And
mm,
something that I've been curious about a lot is that often applications ask for an artist statement and like what is the conceptual framework of your work. And for me, I feel like I go through these different bodies of work and there might be some really loose connections between them. But like the work that I was making 10 years ago, like the artist statement that I would write for that versus the artist statement for the work that I'm doing now is like it's upside
yeah, of
down.
course.
And and so I often wonder like, okay, I have some great work samples from 10 years ago that I could include that, for example, demonstrate how like my ability as a sculptor and
Mhm.
also some conceptual thinking, but doesn't align with my artist statement. And I'm just wondering like your thoughts about that in terms of that kind of dissonance in applications.
Sure, that's a great question. So that's a great clarifying thing, is I would say your best and recent. So, and in fact, some applications will even specifically say within the last 5 years, 2 years, whatever. I think those are good guidelines unless they're very specifically are like, I want to see your ability to do this thing across this time. Like there are applications that they're like, this is a mid-career application to demonstrate that somebody has had a practice that spans 20 years, right? And so in that case, you do show the 20-year span. But more often than not, it's about what's going on now and yeah, I think that's a good point to think not just what's best, but what can have this kind of alignment between what you're saying and what you're showing is useful. And that's where, getting outside eyes can sort of help because it always looks different to you than it does to somebody else. And so to be able, I sometimes even will literally like swap with people and be like, you write mine, I'll write yours, just to see what might get said. And you might not use that exact language, but just to get a sense of what somebody else would see and say about your work and what it's doing. Um, can also be useful sometimes if you've written maybe longer, more meandering things about your work. I highly recommend doing that is like journals, notes, essays, different things that you're researching relative to your work that is not in itself a statement, but you're trying to develop it and figure out how to do it. Use those as like a creative prompt, put them into like word cloud generators and things like that that help you sort of see your own thematics in a clearer way so that um, you can articulate that well to a jury.
That's super helpful. Yeah, that's kind of like what how I generally approach things too, is that sort of like 5 year window, what feels relevant, but it's
Yeah.
also just like a conversation that's been happening in my head. So it's good to hear from another person like, yeah, that seems like a good approach.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
You're welcome. Questions from anyone else?
Okay, so I have a question. This is Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. And I've received information from people that say they apply for grants that have a fee. Other people say they never apply for a grant that has a fee. And then, of course, you have a third point, which is there are a lot of scams out there. So, trying to avoid scams, regardless of that, as long as it's not a scam, do you recommend applying for grants that have a fee, or do you recommend staying away from them?
It's really dependent on the granting program, because you're right, there are ones that are, just sort of pulling in money and not doing anything with it. Um, I can certainly understand the impulse to not. I would say for me, I'm generally only going to apply for stuff that has a fee if I know the grant and I know that it has kind of like I've seen it on several people's resumes as like a real thing. So like for example, the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art is like a nationally recognized, residency program that gives you 3 months 6 weeks to 3 months in these beautiful spaces. It's in Omaha, so it's like in a kind of like not central place. And so you might not necessarily know about it, but if you sort of scan around, you realize that it has this kind of national profile. Um, and I mean, I heard about it from other friends and stuff, but I think things like that, you can sort of like look around for their reputation, find out who's gone to them, stuff like that. It has fees as a way they use that so that, they are able to pay their jurors a decent amount, so it's not like I think that fees are automatically a bad thing. They have a purpose or can have a purpose. I would say above, I don't know, 40, $50, maybe I think that's too much personally. And again, it would sort of depend on the organization. Some organizations also will have fee structures that are like tiered based on when you submit to try to like encourage earlier submissions. Um, so anyway, so I say all that to say that, just like everything else, capitalism's fault, right? So it's like one way or another, people have to sort of like pay to administer the funds, right, to the staff and everybody who are administering, and that's either being absorbed into the overall budget or it's coming in through these application fees. And like you said, there are people out there taking advantage of stuff. The scams that I know of are more, I've heard of ones where it's more like, oh yeah, we're gonna put you into this book that no one's heard of. Or we're gonna put you into this like database that no one's heard of, right? More so than necessarily residencies and grants. At least that's been my experience. Um, so I'd say it really depends. I would say ask around to know whether or not, of other people that who have received the thing, spent, interacted. I would say also like reaching out, that's where reaching out. Like if you reach out and you're dealing with an actual person, an organization, and they have like, you have the ability to really see the infrastructure of the organization and what it's doing and what its track record is, you're going to have more to go on than something that seems like very opaque in terms of what they're doing.
Thank
Oh,
you.
I see some stuff in the chat. Oh, great. Oh, great. Yeah, and application. Yeah, it's so I'm interested. I am really interested in this. I mean, I just like administered a small like grant project through my other job, and and it was tricky. I mean, we did not ask for a fee for it. We absorbed it into the application itself. I mean, into the overall administration of the thing. And we also needed to pay um, the people who are on the jury, and we wanted to pay them better than a lot of our peers because it's a lot of work. And so in our case, that meant a combination of, we funded fewer people, and we did a lot of free labor. You know what I mean? Like capitalism, right? Like it's there. So I think it's like you have to weigh the thing and how it goes, and how to, you know, and again, and consider, how the organization even frames the use and the meaning behind the fee as well, right? Because that I think does make a difference. Like, what is it going towards? How is it being used? What is our general sort of funding structure? Um, I think the more transparent the organization is, the better you'll feel, or we'll all feel about how, resources are being allocated.
I also wanted to say that if you're an artist who's doing your taxes as an artist, that fees can be considered part of your material cost of running business, right? Like, so you pay for your paint, you pay for your canvases, you also have to pay for these fees. And that's like part of what comes as like a subtraction from your profit as an artist. It's like
Oh yeah,
another business expense.
absolutely. Every aspect of this is a business expense, right? So all your internet, your the time, the consulting that you need, because sometimes people do that. They hire somebody to help them. They sort of participate in support services that help with this. All of that is part of your sort of operating expenses. And absolutely, oh my God, we could do a whole session on all the things that we have to deduct in order to make this work. And, that can make a big difference. Mm-hmm. Is there there's time for maybe one last question? Um, well, if folks think of stuff and want to shoot me an email, I can respond. I would just, in general, I would say like, if you hear another one of these come up from another artist, go to it because they're gonna have other tips and ideas, and practice. And remember that when it starts to feel frustrating or confusing or disorienting to do, it's not your fault, it's capitalism.
Thank you so much, Naima, for spending time with us and presenting all this information. It was really helpful. And I think your approach of sharing what has worked for you and your experience is really great because every artist practice is very individual and like depends a lot on what they're making, and everyone has to find ways to support their life and their artistic practice in different ways. So I think like a lot of really great takeaways about like reaching out for resources, focusing on what works best for you, and like getting clear on your vision, and also just that applying to all these things. I think it's very true that sitting down and writing things can like help you think about your work in a different way. And it's just like your art, you have to practice and you get better with it over time. So
Yeah, that last part is the biggest for me, honestly, is like I learn if I don't think I'm going to learn something about what I do, it's literally not worth it. And so that's like the baseline because what else am I doing this for in the first place? Is not for getting rich. So like I gotta get something out of it for myself, and my sort of ability to be the creative person I want to be. Sorry to interrupt you, Ariana, but like I would say if that's not moving in that moment, then it is okay to move on to the next thing. Mhm.
Totally. Yeah. And like Naima was talking about, we have grant opportunities. We have like a smaller grant program we do multiple times throughout the year, and then our big um, grants up to $10,000 for artists. Thrive grants or applications are open right now. And yeah, I'm very happy to say that I will talk to any of you guys. I know a lot of you are familiar with this already, but I'm having office hour appointments in a couple of weeks. And I'm also always just like available all the time to talk to artists about the things we offer, our grants and stuff. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. And yeah, I think we'll call it good. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. It's been really nice to talk to all of you guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.
You
Thank you.
too. Bye.